Hey there and welcome to the Code Wrinkles channel. As you might know, a few days ago .NET 8 was released and I have a confession to make. After all these years we've been together, Blazor is not the same anymore. Indeed, it has drastically changed for better and for worse, and in this video I will walk you through everything you need to know about the new Blazor in .NET 8. But before we get to this, let's have a very short reminder on how exactly Blazor used to work. So up until now, Blazor was all about the different hosting models. So when you wanted to start a new Blazor application, you had a very big decision to make. Do you want to go for the Blazor server or for Blazor WebAssembly? Now, these two different hosting models were kind of like different. The Blazor server was actually generated, or all the HTML was generated on the server, and there was a WebSockets connection always open that listened to events that happened in the browser, and through that WebSocket connection, the new differential HTML was generated and sent back to the browser where it was actually rendered. The other hosting model was Blazor WebAssembly, and in this model, we would ship basically everything to the browser, all the DLLs and everything that we need, so that everything can run in the browser through Blazor WebAssembly. This entire status quo has been literally blown away by Blazor in .NET 8. You can literally take all this idea, all this discussion about hosting models and throw it to the bin. However, I'm not saying yet that this is something bad, but it is something that we really need to investigate. Nowadays, Blazor is all about static server rendering. You might even call it server-side rendering, but you'll see just in a second that this naming might be a little bit misleading. Now, the core concept of a Blazor web application right now is that everything is rendered server-side by default. This brings obviously a lot of different advantages, like very small download sizes, very high speed in everything that happens there, but it also has downsides, because by default, if you have static server rendering, you won't have any interactivity. But here comes the very nice part. So even though we have this default, which is server rendered, if we want to add interactivity to certain pages or even for just certain very small components, we can totally do that by adding on top of this server-side rendering also interactivity for each component. And when it comes to interactivity, we have plenty of choices on how we can do that. We could use, for instance, what it is called an interactive server mode. Now, the interactive server mode actually works exactly the same like the Blazor hosting model previously. The only difference is that by default, when the application is rendered, you just have the server-side rendering, so no WebAssembly connection is established. But in the moment that the component needs to be rendered that is marked with interactive server mode, then the WebSockets connection will be established, a circuit will be established, and everything works just like in Blazor server. But the choices obviously don't stop here. So if you want to go for an interactive mode that is similar to what we had in WebAssembly, then you can definitely use interactive WebAssembly mode, which essentially works exactly the same as the WebAssembly hosting model that we had in previous Blazor version. The only difference also in this case is that only by the time that a component appears on the browser that is marked with interactive WebAssembly mode, only at that point we download the .NET runtime and everything that's needed to run that component interactively in the browser. Besides those two, we have also a third option, which is the interactive auto mode. And the auto mode is kind of like very interesting because it combines together the interactive server with interactive WebAssembly. So in this mode, what we could do, or what the default behavior would be, is that first of all, when the component needs to be downloaded, it will be downloaded through the interactive server mode because it's much quicker. And in parallel, in the background, all the different .NET runtimes and the DLLs and everything that's needed for that component is also downloaded. And when that download completes, that component basically switches to interactive WebAssembly mode. But enough talking, let's see how this actually works in practice. Here's the first Blazor sample that I would like to share with you, and the first thing that catches the eye is the fact that we don't have any razor pages anymore. So we got rid of all that stuff. So the entire structure looks more sleek and it's easier to understand. We have here, for instance, in these components, and you can see that in these components we have even the layout. Here we have, for instance, the app razor, which is the entry point in the application, and in the body here we see that we have the routes, which is the router of this new Blazor web application. And this is all very, very straightforward. In the pages, we have the regular counter, the error, the home, the weather. This application is already configured to work with the interactive server mode as a way to add interactivity to the default server-side rendering. And we can notice this because the way that we set the application up is just a little bit different. So once again, here in the services, we need to add the Blazor components, and then we need to add the mode that we want to use for interactivity. And we'll see a little bit later that we can even combine them. However, in this case, we have this add interactive server components, which adds the interactive server mode or the option to use interactive server mode on our pages and on our components. The other thing that has changed here, because now Blazor virtually works backed by the .NET Minimal API that returns always Blazor components. And that's why here we have this app map Blazor components, and here we specify which is the entry point of the application. And also here we need to specify in this middleware that we want to have interactive server mode enabled if we want some components to be displayed like that. Now I would like to showcase you this counter component. And as you can see here in this counter component, right now we haven't defined anything that defines the rendering mode. Now this is a component, however, that theoretically should need some interactivity. And right now everything will work or would work only based on this Blazor SSR or static server rendering. So let's run the application. Cool, so now we have the web app running. Now if we click here on this counter, we see that the behavior itself, like switching from home to the counter, was actually very smooth, typical for a single page application. Now here there is one thing, if I click on the button, obviously since everything is just server rendered, this button will just not work. However, there are 2 points that I want to be aware of right now. So first of all, the navigation that we had here from home to counter, as you can see, there is no page refresh at all. And I would like to show you something here. So here's our network tab in our developer tools, and we see that basically when we refresh the home page, one thing that is downloaded is actually this Blazor web.js JavaScript file. And as you can see here, it's only done through a fetch. Now, even if we click on the counter, and if we can go back here, we can see that this counter, it is a fetch operation. Now, this is called enhanced routing, and this is a very cool feature in Blazor because even if the application is fully server rendered, as you see when you navigate, you have the very smooth behavior of a single page application. And the way this actually works is that this JavaScript file actually intercepts these requests and makes its own HTTP request, like fetch request, to get only the component that it needs, and then it displays it to the browser. So this is how, even if we have only server-side rendering, at least navigation itself is very smooth. However, the downside, as we have just seen, is that if we click on this button, nothing happens because we need interactivity. So let's add interactivity. Adding interactivity is actually very simple. The only thing that we need to do is to specify the render mode. And here we see that we want to have the render mode interactive server. So here we have our application open, and if we go here on the console, we see that we don't have any type of WebSockets connection. But the moment that we click on the counter, as you can see, a lot of things were downloaded, including also this specific file that was used usually for Blazor server. Let me maybe move this a little bit more to the side. And if we can go to the console, you can see here that we have also an established WebSockets connection. But until we needed to render this component that has or that is marked with this interactive server mode, this was not there. So everything was just server rendered. And obviously now if we just start to click here on this button, everything just works fine and is okay. Now, since the application is running, I want to show you another very important stuff. And these things, if I go here on the weather. And as you can see here, the only thing that we done was actually only one single HTTP request, and we had this brief moment where we had this information that it is loading, and then we got the data, which is a very nice behavior that we would expect in Blazor. However, I have to tell you that this behavior is not achieved through a mechanism that you probably are aware of. So let's move to this weather component. As you can see here, the markup is very similar to what we had previously. But the only thing here is that this component is not marked with interactive server mode, or it is not marked with any type of interactivity. However, it is marked with each attribute, which is stream rendering. And from my point of view, stream rendering is one of the coolest new features that we have in the new Blazor in .NET 8. Now, the concept of this stream rendering is that you are still doing everything fully server-side rendered. However, you can still display conditionally this type of stuff, and the reason why you do this is that the first request that is made here to our application, it's a regular HTTP request response, but it will only get this back. However, the connection will stay open until we get the data, and we have here this task delay to simulate that we wait a little bit for that specific data. And the cool thing here about is that through the exact same connection you have seen earlier that only one single connection was there open, when the data is available, that data will be streamed to the client, to the browser, and then this part will be displayed that will only contain data. And this is one very cool way in which we can add a certain type of interactivity when data fetching without actually doing any interactive server mode or WebAssembly mode. We are just using stream rendering, which is very, very powerful because it means that for components that fetch data, we don't need to add interactivity. They can just be server-side rendered and they will work mostly the way that they worked before or in earlier versions of .NET. And now come the less fun parts. Let's say, for instance, that I want to make this component to be interactive WebAssembly. And the problem is that, well, I really can't do this in this project. So let's switch to another project and understand why. So this project is configured to work with WebAssembly interactivity. However, you will already ask, hey Dan, but why do you have two projects here in this solution? And I would say, hey, that's a really good question. And the answer is because you can't do it differently. And from my point of view, this is a really big pain point. Now let's understand exactly why this is the case. For instance, in order to have WebAssembly interactivity, you also need a host like we have here that is configured for using or for working with WebAssembly. And then the components that you want to have WebAssembly interactivity on, they need to be part of this web host, because when we want to add this interactivity, this host will be actually also downloaded to the browser so that it can add the WebAssembly interactivity. So this means that if you want to have a project, for instance, where you want to configure both, or you want to use both the interactive server mode and interactive WebAssembly, you would need to have at least two projects, because one of them should hold the WebAssembly host and the components that should be rendered with WebAssembly interactivity. Now, the main application is exactly the same like we had previously. The only difference is here that we have activated, or we have configured, or I have configured this application to work with interactive server mode, but also we work with interactive WebAssembly components. And also here in the MapRaiser components, we also have configured it to also work with the WebAssembly render mode, but also with the server mode. And obviously here we also need to add additional assemblies, which is the assembly that contains our WebAssembly interactivity components. That's a little bit cumbersome, I know. Now, the reason why I have configured this application both with interactivity for the server and for WebAssembly is because in this project I want to showcase you also how the auto mode works. But for now, let's just run the application. Once again, we have in split mode with the DevTools because I want to take us a good look at here. Here we have a lot of different files for CSS and SVGs, but there is no WebAssembly, there is no .NET runtime and anything else that would show us that this is or this contains some WebAssembly stuff. Now let me just here clear everything and let's go on counter. And once we went on the counter, if we go back to network, we can see that this time we have a lot of different stuff, like we have a lot of different files here, but we also have these .NET runtimes that we have here. And if we click on this counter, we can see that everything works fine. So now if we come back to our counter component, which is once again in the project that has a WebAssembly host, we see that this component is marked with this render mode interactive WebAssembly. Now what we can do here is change this in interactive auto. And this will go in the next mode, which is essentially from the behavior, we will not see any major differences, but we will see that now what happens is that initially when the component is rendered, it will be rendered through a WebSocket connection, so to this server mode. But afterwards, it will be rendered or used through the WebAssembly interactivity. So once again, we have here nothing, but once we go on counter, we see that suddenly or immediately the button appears because we didn't wait for everything to be downloaded. And in the background, the download still happened. And right now, as you can see, we have once again the .NET runtime. We have this Blazor app VASP. So we have everything downloaded right now. But for the really instance, when we clicked on counter, we already saw the button. So it means it was downloaded via the server. But then in the background, everything was downloaded that needs to be there in the browser for WebAssembly interactivity. There is, however, one other very important topic in the new Blazor that has changed fundamentally, and that is authentication. And I would like to also look into the authentication part, but before we do that, I would like to share some critical thoughts about this new setup with all the SSR and adding different types of interactivity. From my point of view, the main problem here is that we actually have 3 different ways to render components, and the thing is that each type of these components or setups come with different ways to handle the HTTP context, handling data retrieval, and generally handling a lot of different other stuff. And this is obviously very, very painful because from now on, when we want to design our components, we need to be very, very careful to understand exactly, okay, hey, what type of interactivity does this component use? Because if it's using, for instance, server interactivity, and I need to do something, for instance, with EF Core, then I will need to use the IDB context factory and all the stuff that we are accustomed with from the Blazor server and on which I did really a lot of different videos. But if we want to use WebAssembly, then hey, we might need to call an API, so things would be a little bit different. But what if we want to change our component, for instance, from now on to be from interactive WebAssembly to interactive server or vice versa? It means that we would have to set up the component totally differently. And that would also need from us a way of decision making and thinking how do we want to develop that component at all, actually. Because in the end, we would have one option, for instance, to try to make the components basically work on all the different interactivity modes. But in that case, we would definitely need to make some checks, for instance, on the interactivity mode that is currently working, and based on that to implement different type of stuff. And this is, from my point of view, really, really cumbersome. However, we can, for instance, try to make sure that we add interactivity only to components that really need interactivity. And here the stream rendering comes into very nicely, because usually for data retrieval, stream rendering seems to be really very helpful and we don't need to bother with all this stuff. However, what if we just want to have also WebAssembly components and server components? As you have seen, we need to have at least 2 different projects, which from my point of view, once again, is not really an optimal dev experience, and it will give place to a lot of potential mess in our Blazor projects. And I don't know, I have really played a lot with these different interactivity modes, and I started to get the feeling that this Blazor WebAssembly interactivity is something like that distant cousin that is a jerk and that everybody hates and nobody wants to have him around. But obviously, for family dinners, he still needs to be invited. So probably most developers, or at least myself, we will be tempted to use just the server-side rendering with interactive server because I don't have to fire up a different project, a different WebAssembly host. That's a little bit cumbersome, but maybe that's only my feeling. However, still, I think that mixing up together all these interactivity modes is a bad idea because it gives really room to have a lot of potential different problems and maintainability issues down the way with our Blazor applications. But that's enough for that. Let's go over to authentication, because that's really exciting. Here's another project that is set up with individual authentication, and I am really excited about how authentication works in this new Blazor setup. Remember, the default in these Blazor web applications right now, starting with .NET 8, is that everything is server rendered. And therefore, what is the benefit of it is that we always have this request response cycle. And this means that we can get rid of needing, for instance, CSHTML files for authentication, for login and registration. And that was the default that we needed when we used Blazor Server. So if we just take a look here in the different components, you will see that we have here some account components. And here we have a lot of different things. You see that we have manage, we have change password, we have everything here. And if you take a look, everything is a Razor component. So nothing is a CSHTML file, because in this case, we can totally do authentication directly in Blazor. We don't need to kind of like have this very weird workarounds that we had in Blazor server with CSHTML files. Now, if we look a little bit in the files that we have here, which are generated with this template, we can see that what happens in the background, as said, in the new Blazor, basically everything is backed by minimal APIs that return Razor components as return types. And that's why we have here this file in which we have different groups for account and for all the other authentication stuff, so that we can use them in our Blazor application. One other thing that's very nice to see here is in this identity redirect manager is we have this cookie builder, and the cool thing about using this new Blazor SSR by default is that we can rely on cookies for authentication. And from my point of view, cookies are actually very good for authentication. They are even better than JSON Web Tokens, and we can totally use them because everything is server rendered, and whenever you make a call, even if you use something that has WebAssembly interactivity, you still have the cookie, and then you can just use the cookie and it would be used for authorizing a certain request if you make a request to your internal API. Obviously, there's not enough time in this video to go in depth in all the authentication things that we have here in the new Blazor, but I promise you I will probably create plenty of different videos covering authentication topics in Blazor. Because as you might know, I have already created a lot of videos about authentication in Blazor server at least, so definitely I will have to update everything. So as you see, what I said in the intro of this video is or was not really clickbait or just drawing attention. Blazor has indeed changed fundamentally in .NET 8. I hope this video was helpful for you, and if you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button and like it. That would mean the world to me, and it will make it more discoverable also for others that might be interested in this topic. And also don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you didn't do this already. I would totally appreciate that. If you have any comments, ideas, or things that you would like to share, don't be shy and head over to the comment section and leave a comment, and I would be more than happy to get in touch with you. This being said, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.